not by choice, because I had to through the halfway house, and I could not read, I could not sleep, I could not eat. It was the most horrible detoxification, the stuff that I put into my body, just the amounts and what I did to myself was just horrifying. And I met a man, and he looked and sounded like my dad. So I started talking to him, and I asked him to be my sponsor, and he bought me a copy of this book for the first time, the little mini blue big book, and or the mini big book, whatever they call it. And I was trudging through the winter of 2015, nothing left of my life, still waiting for the cops to find me. And every day I would go to the club and have to walk back in the snow and the misery and just the degradation, the point that I ended up in my life. And I would sit at this little cafe in Hackensack by the Johnson Library and have a 50-cent cup of coffee every day before I would go back to the halfway house. And I sat there one dismal day in January of 2015, and when I sat down, the blue book fell on the floor, fell out of my pocket. And I took my first suggestion ever, and I opened that book. And I read Bill's story, right? So I know nothing about AA. I know nothing about the big book. I had been to rehab 30 years before in the 80s when the crack epidemic hit, and I never heard any of this stuff. And I read this guy's story. And here he is, this veteran, right? This knucklehead that comes up with these ideas, these bright ideas that we get, drives up and down the coast with his wife in a sidecar, right? Like coming up with business strategies, and, you know, he's admiring Walter Hagen. He's going to be a famous golfer. He's going to make millions of dollars, and he's this leader and this fanfare and this money and all. And I'm like, wow, like I'm hooked now. I'm reading this story, right? And I see the fall, right? And he mentions twice in his story that faith without works is dead. So I read his story. I was enamored that I never heard this stuff before. I can relate with this guy from this book. I closed the book and I prayed. Truly prayed, truly talked to God for the first time in my life. And I had my first spiritual experience. It was dead silent. It was gray day, snowy, freezing cold. I was all alone in this silent cafe in Hackensack. And I heard the voice. My son, everything's going to be okay. It wasn't audible. It was in my head, but I knew it. I felt it, and I knew it. And I swear to you, this is a true story. The sun cracked through the clouds, came through the window. I was warm from the inside out, and there was nothing playing. It was dead silent. And Don't Stop Believing from Journey comes on the radio all of a sudden. And this is a true story, man. And, you know, the turnaround wasn't fast, but it did start to get better. And then I met my sponsor, who's here tonight, at the club. Things started to happen. Things started to roll. And we did the same thing. And he sat down and freely gave to me what was freely given to him, what was freely given to that guy. So I know my whole big book lineage all the way back to Dr. Bob. Believe it or not, that's where our lineage comes from and how we do this work, with the highlighting and the writing. And of course, as we're going through it, everybody's a knucklehead. Why do I got to highlight that line, not this line? They didn't have highlighters in 1939, right? The whole stories. And dude, just take directions, right? So we ask 3 questions when we get started. Are you willing to go to any lengths to stay sober? Are you willing to see this work through? And are you willing to take directions from me? And I was, just like Joe was, just like the guys that came before him were, that came before me were willing. Because now we're broken, we're busted, we're totally destroyed, and we need a new solution. We need a new way of living and thinking, right? A design for living that really works. That's how the book describes itself, right? A textbook, a living word here that every time you read it means something different. That's the most fascinating part of this book. When you're going through it time and time and time again, it meets you where you're at, right? So going through step 1, right, we we find out what's wrong with us. We find out that we have this allergy. We find out that we have this spiritual sickness. We find out we have this mental illness, right? We find out all these things through the good doctor, and things start to make sense, right? So you want to take from there?
Yeah, so at some point, either a family member, I know there's some Al-Anon in here, a family member, or we ask ourselves, why can't he just stop? Why can't she just stop drinking? Why can't I just stop? And you know, sometimes there's this philosopher, his name is Arkham, he came up with this thing. He said, sometimes the answer is the easiest, sometimes the solution is the easiest answer. Easiest answer is and when you ask, why can't I just stop? The easiest answer is because I can't. Don't know how. I just can't stop. Can't do it. It seems like a simple answer, but it's so deep when you're in the throes of alcoholism, when you're in throes of addiction, when you're a family member watching someone go through it. Why can't they just stop? Because they can't. Because I can't. Because we can't. Without the help of other people. You know, and Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob sat down in 1935, the first meeting in this woman's house, and they, you know, they started this program, and they were there to help each other, right? Without Bill Wilson, Dr. Bob wouldn't get sober. Without Dr. Bob, Bill Wilson didn't get sober. And all they did was talk about, you know, their alcoholism and where it took them and how it made them feel. And this is what we do here today. And this first step, you know, admitting that we're powerless over alcohol. It's easy to say. Anybody can say it. My daughter could say it if I tell her. She's 7 years old. Can you say you're powerless over alcohol? She'll say it, but she has no idea what that means. When I first came into these rooms, I had no idea what that means. Powerlessness is an absolute statement. There is no gray area. There is no power in me that can make me stop drinking. When I say I can't, I can't. So where do we get that power, right? That's what we lack. Bill Wilson says our dilemma was lack of power. You know, and that powerless over alcoholism, when we admit that, when we truly admit that, and on the coin it says, to thine own self be true. Doesn't matter, you could say it to anybody. I could say it to this whole room, I could say it to hundreds of rooms. I said it for almost a decade that I was powerless over alcohol. But I said it up here, I didn't say it in here. It's gotta come from inside, somewhere deep, right? I can't stop and I'm powerless over alcohol. And my life has become unmanageable. Nobody wants to admit that their life is unmanageable. But see, drinking I didn't have a problem drinking. I could drink volumes of alcohol every day. I knew how to do that. I did not know how to live sober. Tell me to live sober, and I was terrified. Because I had no solution. I had no design for living. So being powerless over alcohol and admitting that my life was unmanageable had to come from a place of my own truth and a place of my own understanding. And when I admitted that, we started to take the first step. And the first step, what I learned, it's about 30% of the book. I think I wrote it down in here somewhere from that book you had. The first step, steps 1 and 2, is 67 pages, and it's 38 to 52% of the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this step, when they say it's the only step you need to get right, it's the truth, because if we don't understand this step, if we don't understand who we are, because this step is the description of the alcoholic. If you don't understand who we are, it's impossible to get the other 11 steps. It's impossible. I'm speaking from experience. I can't go to step 2 if I don't understand who I am. And that's what I realized. My spiritual experience came to the first step, because that's when I realized there's nothing more valuable than knowing who you are. Today I'm in the most comfortable place I've ever been in my life, the most peaceful place I've ever been in my life, and I have very little in terms of monetary value. I wouldn't trade that for anything. So that first step, for me, opened my eyes to knowing the value of who I am and what I need to do. And it gave me, not even courage, it gave me the ambition to want to go through the rest of this book. And not only to go through it, but to go through it with someone that has been there, has been through it before. Someone that was opening my eyes. You see, I can't mess with this book if I don't have someone guiding me through it. I can't mess with the 12 steps if I don't have someone guiding me through it. If I mess with it, I'm going to mess it up. It's guaranteed, because I'm going to start making things up. Because the words are barriers. But they're only barriers if you don't know what they point to. When Nicki started reading to me, and I was like, that was my first impression. He started reading to me. I'm like, what's this guy doing? You know, I'm a grown man. But it wasn't the man that was reading to me. It was the spirit of the man that was reading to me. Something was coming out of him that was expressing the truth, and I knew it. I felt it. It was palpable. It didn't matter how I felt. It didn't matter what energy I had. That didn't even faze him. He just continued to read, and I continued to listen. And I continued to hear more and more truth. And as we went through step one, I started to become awake, and I started to understand who I am. And I started to see what my dilemma was. And I started to identify with Bill Wilson. I started to identify with the alcoholic. I started to identify with the things he was saying. Because for me, it was the truth. There was no mistaking it. And we know, as human beings, we know when something is said that it's true. We know it. We can feel it in ourselves. You know, and as we move through step one, for weeks, you know, we started to bond and create a relationship. And I started to ask him questions, and he started to answer them. And you know what? If he didn't have an answer, you know what he said to me? He didn't make anything up. He said, I don't know, but we'll find out together. Because everyone that goes through this step, you know, everyone's different, and they come up with different questions, and they have different experiences. And that was the most beautiful part of it, is that we did this together. Even though he did it with somebody else, his experience with me and my experience with him will never be the same. And that's where the value starts, and that's where the relationship starts to grow, and that's where the bond starts to grow when we move on to step two. You want to move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to differentiate between, you know, step one being two parts, right? The powerlessness and the unmanageability. These are two totally separate things, right? The page 24 says the fact for most alcoholics, for reasons yet